Our earlier speakers referenced a lot of things, and chief among them are the shortage guidelines of 2007, the Drought Contingency Plan, and what's going to be happening in the next 6 years as we head to the need to have a new set of rules in 2026. So here to set the stage for that are Jessie, Khaya, and Rebecca Smith, and they're from the Lower Colorado Region's Office of the Bureau of Reclamation. These are the folks that have their hands on the throttle at Lake Mead. But as it happens, both Jessie and Rebecca are based at the University of Colorado, and their work in modeling is heavily focused on this next critical period. So again, without further ado, here are our speakers. Yeah, there's always that. Thank you.
All right. Sounds a lot better from up here, so hoping you can hear me better out there. But yeah, we're really excited that to be invited to come by the Colorado River District and talk to you guys today. We're going to talk to you about the Colorado River Basin, the current state of the system, and some of our ongoing research efforts. Just to give you kind of a rundown on where we're planning on going for this talk, we're going to talk about the state of the system. So our current status, future projections, the Drought Contingency Plan, or DCP, and evolving risk and hydrologic uncertainty that we deal with in our modeling projections. I'm going to then hand it over to Rebecca, and she's going to go over our research program and talk about the background of this program, some of our short, mid, and long-term studies that we have going on, and then touch on the state of the science report. Now, I'm sure several of you have seen this slide a million times. It's a reclamation presentation, so couldn't get away without showing it to you. The Colorado River Basin covers 7 states and 2 countries. Domestically, we have this basin divided into 2 basins, the Upper Basin, which is shown on our map in that tannish color, and the Lower Basin, which is shown in that salmon pink color. We have 16.5 million acre-feet allocated annually. 7.5 million acre-feet of that water is allocated to the Upper Basin, another 7.5 million acre-feet to the Lower Basin, and then 1.5 million acre-feet to Mexico. Most of our annual flow, that naturalized annual flow, originates in the Upper Basin. We have about 60 million acre-feet of average annual flow. Our inflows are highly variable from year to year. Our system does contain 60 million acre-feet of storage, with 50 million acre-feet of that storage falling within Lakes Powell and Lake Mead. So we can store about 4 times our average annual inflow. Our operations and water deliveries are governed by what's known as the law of the river. So this is a collection of different federal legislation, decrees, contracts, compacts that we use to govern the river. We've heard about a few of them already from Brad's presentation, so the Interim Guidelines and the Drought Contingency Plan, the DCP, and he provided some really thoughtful ideas about these operation policies. We always love hearing back from our stakeholders and other interested parties in the basin, so really great to hear different ideas. So as I previously mentioned, our system has 60 million acre-feet of storage, and 50 million acre-feet of that sits within Lakes Powell and Lake Mead. On the slide right now, you are looking at a bar chart that shows the combined storage of Lake Powell and Lake Mead since 1999. We have a light blue line there that's showing you the unregulated annual inflow into Lake Powell. And what we mean by unregulated flow is the flow Lake Powell would have seen entering it without the reservoir operations of the reservoirs that sit above it. As you can see, in 1999, our reservoirs were essentially full. In the following years, we hit a prolonged drought. So we've been in a drought for about 20 years now. And you can see our current combined storage is sitting just below 50%. We're at about 48, projected to end the year at about 48% capacity currently. We can see the variability of our inflow from our unregulated inflow line there. Bounces around a lot, but If we look over our past drought, we can see that only 5 years in the past 20 have produced above average flows. The rest of those years have been below average flows, and we can see that our reservoir storage has taken a hit. Now, thanks to the storage we have in our system, we have been able to avoid shortage in the Lower Basin. But if we look at 2018, which we all know was a bad year, you can see we're sitting at about 41% of our combined storage capacity and 43% of our average unregulated inflow. So we took a pretty good hit that year. And if you look at the record, well, that 41% is the lowest you're definitely going to see on this chart, and it's the lowest combined storage capacity we've had since Lake Powell began filling. Things are looking a lot better in 2019. As we heard from Jeff's talk, we had a crazy snowpack last year, which resulted in above average inflows. We've also had the passing of the Drought Contingency Plan, which has incentivized some conservation that we're seeing in the Lower Basin. So it's given us a nice little uptick there in our storage. So that's where we're sitting right now, but the big question is, what does it look like as we move forward? Right now on our slide, you are looking at projections from the August 24-month study. That top graph, we are looking at projected pool elevations for Lake Powell, and on our bottom graph, we are looking at projected pool elevations for Lake Mead, and that yellow line is indicating the end of this calendar year. If we look at our projections, we can see that we are projecting Lake Powell at its most probable projection will end the year at elevation 3,618.6 feet, which puts it in the upper elevation balancing tier. For water year 2020, we are projecting 8.23 million acre foot release, but of course there is the possibility for an April adjustment. When we look at Lake Mead, we're seeing we are projected to end the calendar year at that most probable projection at 1,089.4 feet. So that puts us, given our interim guideline operations, in the middle of our normal operations or ICS surplus tier. However, in May, we did sign in the DCP, so Drought Contingency Plan. And so starting January 1st, we will see DCP contributions from the states of Arizona and Nevada. And we will also see contributions from the country of Mexico through the Binational Water Scarcity Program, because we're sitting below elevation 1,090 feet. If we look on the left, we can see we have some tables there that are showing our projected end of calendar year 2019 and 2020 pool elevations for Powell and Mead. The end of calendar year 2019, you can see for Lake Powell, our projections range maybe a couple of feet of elevation. At Lake Mead, we're looking within 1 foot of elevation with our projections. If we look out 1 year further to 2020, we can see a much broader range in our projections. So we are looking at our minimum, most, and maximum probable projections from that August 24-month study. By the end of 2020, you're looking at a range of about 60 feet in elevation in Lake Powell, about 50 feet at Lake Mead. So there's a lot of uncertainty of where we could end up next year. Now, I've mentioned it a couple of times, so I may as well take a moment to stop and step back and talk about the Drought Contingency Plan, or DCP. So these actions are added on in addition to the 2007 Interim Guidelines. And really, the main goal here was to reduce the risk of both Lake Powell and Lake Mead reaching critically low elevations in their reservoirs. Some of the key elements of this operational guidelines, it does have additional contributions of water by Lower Basin states. And this includes Arizona, Nevada, and California. There's additional flexibility for water storage and recovery to incentivize conservation, so to try to promote additional conservation. And then we have drought operations and demand management in the Upper Basin. And so this is, again, to protect those critically low elevations and also provide some security for hydropower generation and reliable releases to the Lower Basin. So it's great to know what it is, but why do we need it? Why did this really come about? I think, the best way to tell this story is by looking at this sustained drought that we've been in for the past 20 years. Right now on the slide, you are looking at our historical pool elevations at Lake Mead since 1999. So as we know, we started a drought in the year 2000. And these are our pool elevations leading up to 2007. In 2007, of course, we had our interim guidelines. And leading up to these negotiations, we had 5 years of unprecedented drought. We had no guidance on what to do for a shortage in the Lower Basin, and we had never hit a shortage in the Lower Basin. And also, our reservoirs weren't very coordinated. So we had coordinated operations between Lake Powell and Lake Mead at those higher elevations, but we didn't have anything beyond that. So everyone sat down, negotiated, came up with a plan, and that plan was the interim guidelines. You can now see I've added on the slide our operational tiers at Lake Mead as per the 2007 interim guidelines. We have a grayed outline there, and that grayed outline is showing the median projections from 2007 after we implemented those guidelines. So this is the median pool elevation we projected at Lake Mead. You can see it's sitting kind of pretty steady there around 1,100 feet in elevation. Unfortunately, history did not follow those projections, and we had a sustained drought, so our drought continued. And you can see that our pool elevations were lower than we thought at that median projection, and we're sitting right above storage. And our look of risk is very different now than we thought it would be in 2007. If we look at where we're projecting we're going today, I've thrown up projections from our June 2019 CRSS run. This is without the DCP. And this hydrology ensemble is from resampling our full natural flow records, so from 1906 to 2017. If we look at that solid line in the middle, that median is showing, instead of kind of holding steady as we're seeing in those 2007 interim guideline projections, we're seeing a slight decrease. And at the end of 2026, we see at that median, we're in this level 1 shortage. If we want to throw on even a different look of this risk, I've now thrown up from those June projections our stress test hydrology. So this hydrology is based off of resampling our flow record from 1988 to 2017. This ensemble is really based on some research we've seen that shows a shift in those temperature trends in the late 1980s. And as we've heard from Jeff Lucas today, we can see that this affects our runoff efficiency. So you're not getting the same stream flow for the same amount of precipitation as we were seeing in the past. When we look at that median projection, again, we're seeing a downward trend, but this is even more pronounced than our full hydrology. And at the end of 2026, we're ending up in a level 2 shortage condition. So even more shortage than we're seeing with our full hydrology. Taking a different look at this risk, you can see on the left hand of your slide right now, we are looking at a graphic that's showing the different shortages and reductions for both the US and Mexico, giving those interim guideline operations for different elevations of Lake Mead. On the right-hand side, we're looking at 2 graphs that are showing the risk of falling below key elevations in Lake Powell on the top and Lake Mead in December of the end of the calendar year. The gray shaded area is showing us what our projections were for the 2007 interim guidelines of this risk. And that red line is showing us, with that stress test hydrology, our projections of that risk without the DCP. You can see that those projections are multiple times greater than that interim guideline risk. So our risk has greatly increased. If we throw the DCP on there, now on our graphic, you can see our DCP contributions from our recent legislation, and also Mexico's water savings. And this comes from the Binational Water Scarcity Plan. And you can see that through our blue line, which is the same projections, but now with the DCP added on, our risk is much more in line with what we were projecting through the 2007 interim guidelines. So this Drought Contingency Program, or DCP, really is a crucial bridge to help us reduce those risks and hold us over until we're able to go ahead and renegotiate new operational guidelines. So hydrologic uncertainty. We've talked about, so far, some of our short-term projections, again, that 24-month study. And our midterm projections shown here, those are CRSS results. But we also do long-term projections. And I know Brad's already shown this figure, said it's shown a million times. I'm going to show it to you guys one more. This is some of our long-term projections from our basin study. One thing you'll note about all of these projections is we have a range of possible outcomes as you look into the future. It's not hovering around one projection, one elevation or one water supply. And this is because we run our models with hydrologic ensembles, right? So I don't know what the exact hydrology is going to be in 50 years. I don't even know what the exact hydrology is going to be in 5 years. So we run ensembles. But, however, this really can make it more difficult for water managers to plan for the future with this level of uncertainty. So we really do have a need in our basin to understand our past and what that can tell us about our future, a need to understand future potential hydrologies that we may encounter, and also a need to figure out ways that we can make decisions and plan for the future as water managers with such a high level of uncertainty. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Rebecca Smith.
Thanks, Jessie. Well, Reclamation has known for many years that in order to learn more about our system and reduce that uncertainty, we have to engage with the research community to bring in the knowledge they have and to connect their expertise with what we need. And so we formally formed a research program back in 2004. And so the earliest projects we funded ended up influencing the 2007 Interim Guidelines EIS. First, we had Appendix N, which explored the sensitivity of the system to scenarios besides observed hydrology. Brad already mentioned that, and he also mentioned Appendix U, which synthesized climate science up to that point, the implications for the Colorado River Basin, and provided some recommendations that informed our research agenda going forward. And I want to point out that most of the people at the speaker table were involved in that. Specifically, Brad was one of the lead authors. So we still work from that today. Besides this Appendix U, we are also working from the recommendations from Reclamation-wide short-term and long-term reports that looked at how can we plan in the face of climate change. And in the early years, the research program was exclusively focused on climate and hydrology, but going forward and currently, we've kind of expanded our focus. And used to be the hydrology work group, now we refer to ourselves as the Colorado River Basin Research to Operations Program. One of the things we learned is that we really have to make a concerted effort to improve the transfer of research findings into operations, and that means we have built some in-house capacity to do that testing, and we're also emphasizing the testing phase in the research scopes that we write. Recently, so we've always collaborated with a variety of scientists on this research, but recently we've been also collaborating with stakeholders to scope and prioritize and fund certain research projects, and I want to specifically call out a group of kind of self-organized state and water utility stakeholders who coalesced after a 2017 hydrology symposium, and we've been working with them and also NOAA, 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 to prioritize research and to leverage a lot of funds that have resulted in a lot of new projects over the last year. So we're really excited to get more activity and more funds for that. I mentioned we're expanding our scope a little. You've already heard that, we can learn a lot about hydrology, but we also have to look at how are we making decisions, how are we planning. So we have expanded to decision science as well. Now, we try to address short, mid, and long-term studies and research that supports them, and I will give you a quick rundown of the projects we recently completed or have going on right now. So short-term for us means a couple of months to a couple of years, and primarily supports the studies we perform with our 24-month study model. One project that we wrapped up just this summer looked at climate-informed subseasonal to seasonal forecasts, and the question here was, can we use skillful climate variable forecasts like temperature, precip, sea surface temperatures, and translate those into more skillful stream flow projections? And the figure on the right-hand side is at a watershed scale nationwide, whether those climate variables showed skill. Another project that is just now getting going has to do with consumptive use modeling by the Colorado Basin River Forecast Center, whose forecasts we use in our 24-month study modeling. And the question is, can we use consumptive use data from other sources, such as the state of Colorado, so that their models perform better, and thus improving the streamflow forecast that we use in our models and improving our projections? For midterm, which to us means 2-ish to 5-ish years into the future, and impact studies we perform with our midterm model we call MTOM. A project that wrapped up a little over a year ago produced the Colorado Basin Streamflow Forecast Testbed. And the point of this was we need an objective, repeatable, structured, defensible way to evaluate the streamflow forecasts we use in our modeling. Not only do we want to look at what we currently use, we want to be able to compare it to experimental forecasts. And the figure you see on the right is the result of using that test bed on those climate-informed forecasts I was just talking about, where it's comparing it to 2 different methods we currently use. We also are planning on using this test bed to test the results of the second project, temperature-informed streamflow projections. And the kind of scope of that project is to really take a deep dive into how temperature has affected our streamflow historically on a sub-basin scale, and then combine that information with skillful temperature predictions to hopefully produce improved streamflow forecasts into the midterm. And finally, we have our long-term research. For us, that means 5 to 50 or more years into the future, and it impacts studies that we use CRSS to perform. The first project is one where we explored CMIP-5 projections. How does CMIP-5 compare to CMIP-3 in terms of skill, climate hydrology, system impacts? And we also wanted to know what do the downscaling techniques, how do they affect the projections we get? There's no guidance on what you should do to go from global climate projections to the streamflow that we put into our models. And what you choose has a big effect, is what we've learned. That report should be out early next year. And based on how much we saw that these downscaling techniques affect the flows, we commissioned another study, the second study, which is comparing an additional 2 downscaling methods to the 2 we have in the CMIP-5 report. And the final project is exploring many objective robust decision-making, or MORDM for long-term planning. We have to plan into the future. Our uncertainty grows and grows as the further you look out. We know we can't plan for average historical. We can't even plan for the average of the climate models. And so we want to think about, can we perform well enough in those really bad scenarios while doing really well in maybe better scenarios? Because if we've learned anything from how long this drought went on, how deep it got, how crazy this year was, studying climate change in the basin, is that we don't know what's going to happen, and we need to be prepared and do some responsible planning. So that's something we're exploring, for potential future use. Finally, the Colorado River Basin Climate and Hydrology Science State of the Science Report. Jeff already mentioned this. I think Brad mentioned it, stealing our thunder, but it's an update to Appendix U, essentially. We, along with 10 other agencies, funded it as a group. Jeff and Liz and Lenica are the authors, the primary authors at Western Water Assessment. And even though it is oriented around supporting the studies that Reclamation does and the particular types of studies that water management agencies are interested, we really think of it as a resource to anyone interested in the Colorado River Basin. Citizens, stakeholders, scientists, everyone should check it out. We expect it in December. It's out for review right now. Some of the sponsor reviewers may not have made as much progress on their review as would be ideal. But we believe that Western Water Assessment will wrangle these cats eventually, and we expect a really good report. So the takeaways from the entire presentation are that hydrologic uncertainty has been and will always be a major challenge in the Colorado River Basin. And in the face of uncertainty and the new information we got from the depth of this drought, the DCP does represent a successful response, and it effectively reduces the risk of reaching critical elevations through 2026 when those new guidelines will be in place. Reclamation has been doing research for a long time. Our program is evolving, it's robust, and it's exploring research that will inform our ongoing activities as well as future activities such as renegotiating the guidelines. For more information about our research program, please visit our website or you can email us at that address. Thank you.
Do we have any questions? So I have one. So clearly, it appears that Reclamation is amping up the science to get ready for the renegotiations. Does that, what does that speak to? That, you know, something we should have, could have, would have done in 2007, or, you know, how can we put that in context? Overall, yes, this is very good.
Yeah, that's a good question, and as someone has already pointed out, hindsight is 20/20. But the reality of this drought certainly has motivated a lot of energy going into what can we learn about our system, and even more motivation, I would argue, for how are we going to plan, what else can we do to inform the upcoming process. So that's why we're looking at the research we're looking at.
Thank you. Would anybody else have a question? Rachel. Yeah, we got two mics coming your way.
Thank you so much for being here and the presentation and the really in-depth of knowledge. I'm just wondering, we read continually where the federal government, current administration is kind of eliminating the word climate change and not wanting any discussion or real rejecting findings along those lines from any given agency. How is your agency going to incorporate climate science into the study?
That's another good question. The great thing about water management is that people want you to do a good job and bring science and information in regardless of the words you use when you describe that science. We haven't felt any pressure. Our commissioner has said that climate change exists, and we know that we can bring in climate-informed information to our studies one way or another, so we're not really concerned about that.
One more, perhaps? Okay, thank you very much, Jessie and Rebecca. So our next speaker is Andy Mueller, who is the general manager of the Colorado River District. And his role in the morning will be to offer insights from the Colorado River District, the state of Colorado, and perhaps the Upper Basin on the various things that we've heard, whether it's climate change, whether it's how PAL operates, whether it's drought contingency planning, and certainly perhaps the state's endeavor to study the feasibility of demand management, which would be part of the Upper Basin's piece of the Drought Contingency Plan. So Andy, he's not going to have a PowerPoint. He's just going to have this pretty picture, and he's going to riff on a lot of issues. And I've never seen him do that well before either.
Well, thank you very much, Jim. And I want to thank all of our presenters today and Jim for putting together a panel, which I think truly has done, it's a demonstration of what we're committed to at the Colorado River District. And what that is supporting and developing good science that will be translated into good policy on the Colorado River. And our district is fortunate enough to be taxpayer supported here out of our 15 counties on the western slope. And with that money, we spend a large percentage of that supporting and driving science on the Colorado River. Because without accurate science, without really knowing what's going on in the river and in our mountains, and most importantly, what's likely to come, we are not going to be able to do our job in terms of protecting Western Colorado and our water resources. And I think that's important. By the way, Jim said that I'm going to speak from 3 different perspectives, and I want to be really clear. I'm going to speak from one, which is the Colorado River District's perspective. Now, we fit in within the state of Colorado because we are charged with assisting the state in protecting Colorado's entitlement under the Colorado River. So, but the perspective is solely that of myself and the Colorado River District. We also fit within the Upper Colorado River Commission and the Upper Basin, as several of us on the district serve as advisors to our commissioner and to the UCRC legal and engineering committees. I am not here speaking on behalf of the UCRC. Again, I'm only here on behalf of the Colorado River District. I will bring our perspective, and I welcome your input to what our perspective should be to those other bodies, but I just don't want anybody to think that I'm speaking for our state or our Upper Colorado River Commission. They get really touchy when I say I do, so I can't do that. The thing that I think the earlier presenters have really nailed is that we have always had variable weather patterns, variable climate on the Colorado River. But as we look at what's happened over the last 19 years and we look what is likely to happen in the next 20, 30, 50 years, we can see some trends that are really significant in the variability that's being driven by climate change. And it is, climate change has turned into, and I think one of the last questions hit on this, into a politically charged word. And I don't think it needs to be in Western Colorado, because we all have the same interests, right? And our job at the River District, just like the job of people who run utilities, the people who run large irrigation projects or small ranches, is to figure out what certainty we can in the development of operational plans for our ranches, our farms, our water users, in our case, throughout Western Colorado. And you can't develop a good plan unless you understand what the worst case scenario may be. And yes, you know, it's, as they say, you have to plan for the worst and pray for the best. But in planning, you've got to understand what that range of variability can be, and I think Brad Udall did a great job of pointing out that we oftentimes look at models and we think that they're probabilistic, like they're going to actually tell us what the future is definitely going to look like. And it doesn't, they don't do that. I think these guys do a great job of explaining it's a range. And so often we look at the range and we look for that tiny red line in the middle of the graph and we say, well, that's the most likely outcome, so we should plan for that. I have to tell you, at the River District, we can't plan for that, because that would mean that there's a 50% chance that we have missed the boat and our water users in Western Colorado don't have water in the future. And that's not an acceptable outcome from our perspective. So it's not a political statement from the River District or our board when I talk about climate change. It's an obligation to plan for the worst case scenario. So in that light, I want to talk a little bit about the drought contingency plans and what's important in there for Western Colorado and what we at the River District are pushing for, and what where we probably need help and input from our water users here in Western Colorado. First, I want to touch on the drought contingency plans, and I think Jessie and Rebecca's graphs showed the aid that the drought contingency plans are bringing to kind of the worst case scenario on the Colorado River. Most of that, if not all of that in those graphs, is from the drought contingency plans that have been adopted and now implemented in the Lower Basin. And so they are, as of January 1, this coming January 1, cutting back on their water use. And that's no small feat, that's to be applauded. But I would tell you that the intentionally created surplus, and I think Brad and I actually agree on these points, the intentionally created surplus back starting in 07, the drought contingency plan additions to that are a good start, but they don't solve this problem. And in fact, the way they're designed, from many of the details that our prior speakers got into, they're actually designed in a way that will keep this system in crisis. The Lower Basin is overusing water every single year. They overuse it between 1.1 and 1.3 million acre feet a year because they don't account for their evaporative loss and their transit loss in the water that is used in the Lower Basin system. They point to Supreme Court cases and other things that might indicate that they have the right to do so, but we disagree, number one, that they do, and number two, we think that it's frankly morally and legally irresponsible of them to continue that overuse and that failure to account for that. If, even at its best, at the lowest levels of Lake Mead, when the Drought Contingency Plan is kicking in and all 3 states in the country of Mexico are, quote, conserving water, leaving water in Lake Mead, that's about 1.4 million acre feet. So in those years when the system is at its lowest level, at its biggest crisis level, they fix their structural deficit temporarily. But as was pointed out by earlier speakers, there are all sorts of mechanisms and escape hatches for them to pull that water back out. So it's actually not a solution in any way, shape, or form for this structural deficit that exists. So it's like maybe they've taken lessons in the Lower Basin from our federal accounting system, right? We're gonna run a deficit until we're the biggest, baddest borrower on the planet, and we're too big to fail, right? So is that what the Lower Basin is doing? And I think we've got to look at that and understand it and inform our decisions going forward in these interim guideline renegotiations that are coming up. The Upper Basin, despite our lack of economic might relative to the Lower Basin, despite our lack of political might, really needs to push the Bureau of Reclamation and the Lower Basin into actually fixing the structural deficit in a permanent manner, which means, thanks. It means some really hard facts. It's going to mean some very hard negotiations, but it's something that we have to recognize keeps the system out of balance. And it's led to this drought contingency planning, right? And so let's look at the Upper Basin. We're going to reoperate our crisp reservoirs, the reservoirs that were created to protect Upper Basin consumptive use. It's good. That's what they're designed to do. We're going to release water out of the 3 upper ones, Flaming Gorge, Navajo, and Blue Mesa. At times we need to support a certain level in Lake Powell, 3525. That protects the power production. It protects, if 3525 is protected, then we don't have to worry about compact non-compliance in the Upper Basin. On the other hand, we talk about another leg of that stool, which is demand management. And that is, let me say, under both the Upper Basin Demand Management Agreement and our states, the state of Colorado's, the Water Conservation Board's policy statement, it is to be used solely for the purposes of compact compliance, right? Now, compact compliance, in my mind, on behalf of Western Colorado, does not mean preserving power pool. It means preserving our right in the Upper Basin to consumptively use our entitlement under the Colorado River. So what does that mean? It means that we need to only engage in demand management and have any water that is ever conserved in that program used to protect our consumptive uses in the Upper Basin. And it's not about protecting one particular utility. It's not about protecting one use over another within the Upper Basin. It's about protecting all uses in the Upper Basin. It's the ag community, it's the urban users, it's industry, it's our environment and our recreation that all need to be protected to keep the Upper Basin whole. Before our state embarks on a demand management program or implements anything, it is really important that the state and that the policymakers at the UCRC explore every other option before we start reducing our consumptive use in the Upper Basin. So what are those options, right? How do we make sure that we need to do that, right? That we need to go through the potential economic damage and the social costs of reducing water consumption particularly in western Colorado, but in our entire state. There are lots of things we need to look at, and that's the modeling and the river system. That's the sanctity of the power pool at Lake Powell. Is there water below 3525 that can be used to protect the Colorado and the Upper Basin's entitlement? What risks do we run if we dip below those levels? And I think it's not just the scientists and the modelers and the policy wonks who, like myself, who need to understand that. It's our water users who have to understand what the true risks are. You're going to hear a little bit later today from John Caron of Hydros Engineering, who has been doing a risk study. We're in our third phase and identifying questions for our fourth phase of a risk study. And that risk study, the whole point of it is to help elevate the level of understanding among everybody on the western slope, everybody in the state, and frankly, everyone in the Upper Basin. What are the risks we're facing, and therefore identify what the potential solutions are. It's important to know that the operational guidelines that we agreed to in 2007 have resulted in, I think, over delivery under the compact of 10 to 11 million acre feet since 2007. You can compare that back to the long-range operating criteria that were in place before that. It's arguable. I've seen lots of modeling one way or the other. It's arguable that we would be in the same or even worse position under the long-range operating criteria. So it's not solely the fault of the 2007 guidelines. It's the way those two reservoirs are operated since Powell came online in the 60s. Powell is supposed to be our savings account. So are the other Upper Basin CRISP reservoirs. How do we make sure that when it's operated under future guidelines, that it actually is operated in a way that truly protects us in these very real, predictable, long-term droughts that we're likely to experience in the future as we see a hotter climate coming our way. And I think that we've gained a lot of insight. I think that we have to be willing in those drought contingency documents, and more importantly in the interim guideline documents, we have to be willing to look at really creative, out-of-the-box solutions, whether it's the grand bargain that's coming up, or whether it's, we've accepted and you've heard about the tiering structure within Lake Powell and Lake Mead and how it determines certain releases. I think we need to go back to the drawing board and look at exactly what our obligations are under the compact and how those reservoirs can be operated in a way that we're meeting our compliance, but we're not over-complying. And how, I will say, in any negotiation, right, you don't want to get into the details in a public fashion that would tip your hat off for the Lower Basin. There are a number of really great minds working on this in the Upper Basin, and with some really creative ideas. Those of us who have signed agreements and serve as advisors to the UCRC don't have the ability to discuss all of that in public the way Brad might as an academic, the way Eric might as a retired general manager of the River District, the way Doug does. And so it's pretty exciting to be able to hear some of these ideas really bandied about, and I appreciate their willingness to do that. But we've got to put everything on the table and figure out these creative solutions. So one of those solutions, and this is what's causing a lot of concern on the Western Slope, is this demand management concept, right? It is something that I look at today as a potential pilot program prior to 2026 to see if it should be incorporated into the ongoing interim guidelines beyond 2026. So should we agree to something that includes a demand management program? Well, coming back to Western Colorado and what we need to make sure happens is we have a state process that's going on that is by and large an educational process, which is good because they're out educating folks on what demand management might bring. But what we don't have at the state level or at the UCRC level is a process that actually gets meaningful input from the owners of water rights in Western Colorado, the ag producers, the urban producers, the industry, because we need to know what works for them. And I want to essentially put a challenge to everyone in this room who owns a water right, everyone who works for people who own water rights, that we need those water right owners to be driving this process. So it's really good that I am and the rest of the district and hopefully you will question the need for demand management. But we need to go back and recognize that there are an awful lot of people driving that train towards demand management. So if it's going to happen, if it is determined that we have to go there, the rules, the way that market is set up, the way it protects or doesn't protect Western Colorado and our communities will largely be determined by the input on those rules and that structure. And it is something that we value at the River District. We want the input from every one of our water users who has ideas and thoughts. They're not, many of our water users aren't going to have PhDs behind their names. They're not going to have expertise in modeling, but they know how their businesses run. They know how their operations run. They know what it means that if they're going to fallow 20% of their land for 3 out of 10 years, they know what it means to their cow-calf operation. They know, if you're an urban provider, what it means to your outdoor urban canopy in Grand Junction if you're going to cut down on water use, outdoor water use by 20%. So we need those people at the table to talk about the costs that are associated with those efforts, but also the potential benefits, what they might do, and how we might actually structure those rules, how we at the River District and other Western Slope agencies can bring that voice into the state and into the UCRC and drive that process. So if we have to go there, we're not just sitting back and letting it happen to us, we're actually driving the train in Western Colorado. And it's really important because, yes, the state government, the CWCB, they do represent Western Colorado, along with the 85% of the voting public who lives on the Front Range, the metropolitan Front Range, I might add. So we need to stand up and look at what's in our interest. And it's not ideologically, but from a very practical, on-the-ground, market-based, what would work and what wouldn't work for our producers, for our water right owners. We at the River District are embarking on a stakeholder process in a formal manner over the next several months, but we would encourage anyone with ideas or thoughts or concepts, concerns, to reach out and talk to our staff. And I will say our staff, you've all seen them running around in their shirts. Drop us a note, hit us online, whatever you can, because we are very interested and we need to gather the voice of the Western Colorado and inject it into these discussions so that we're protecting and doing our job. With that, I would say that I'm going to do the unheard of at a meeting, which is actually end early, unless there are questions.
Yeah, you're not ending early yet. Any questions? All right, that means I have one. So I will pose somewhat the same question I posed over here about what's going to happen. It seems like the Lower Basin's got a great deal, even though I know they give good lip service to, yeah, we got to get rid of the structural deficit. But they got a great deal, and we want a better deal. How's that going to play out?
Well, everybody wants a better deal than they have today, right? So I imagine the Lower Basin actually has lots of ways they could get more water in the negotiations. And I think really in any negotiation, when you come to the table and say, look, these are our interests, and this is why we're here, and this is what we're doing. In order for us to be successful, we also have to recognize the interests of the Lower Basin. So it's very easy for someone in my position, for instance, to criticize, as I have and probably will again in the future, the cities of Scottsdale and Phoenix and others in that metropolitan area who have increased their deliveries through the Central Arizona project by 300 to 500,000 acre feet a year as they saw the system crashing, as they saw the likelihood of them being cut off as the junior. Their orders for water were climbing. Now, their consumptive use was not going up. What they were doing was dropping the water into aquifers around the cities and in areas that they think one day they might be able to get 70% of the water back out by pumping. So what were they doing? They were hoarding. They were hoarding a natural resource that we all depend on in the river. So I criticize them for that. I've done it before, I'm doing it now. But we designed a system that put them at risk as the junior on the Lower Basin system, and they acted in their own self-interest. So how do we design operating guidelines in the future that prevent that selfish self-interest from ruining the rest of us, right? If those 300,000 to 500,000 acre feet a year that were dropped into the aquifers in Arizona were instead in Lake Mead, Lake Powell could have as much as 8 million more acre feet in it today. So how do we help them feel secure in their future while we also can feel secure in ours? That's how we win in the negotiations.
Anybody have a question? Oh, we have a question. Marty.
Thanks. Andy, you mentioned needing more input from people who are actually using water. And my observation was that the demand management committees set up by the CWCB, in order to be orderly and useful, are fairly small committees. And so not everybody, and particularly not everybody on the West Slope who wanted to participate in those committees was selected. So what is the mechanism now in that process for water users, ranchers, irrigation community, and so on, who are not on the committee, to actually have some input before, there's a done deal on the table?
Sure. Well, Marty, I appreciate the question, and I just want to point out for the audience, so I've now had a question from an employee and one from one of my bosses. So if anybody else wants to ask me questions where I don't have so much pressure, that'd be fine. Marty, and the rest of you, what I would say is there are a number of ways. When these committees were announced, the work groups at the CWCB, our district asked to have someone put on all of the committees, staff members. We ended up with staff members on 5 of the 8 or 9 committees. We also asked that those meetings be held in public, and that they be recorded and dispersed, that the information be dispersed throughout the water user community. They are now being held in public, thanks to the CWCB board and the staff, and we really appreciate their responsiveness on our request there. I think it's good public policy. So anyone who wants to attend or has time to attend a work group meeting can do so now. They can participate, provide input in writing or verbally. But I would also say that what I recognize after years of representing very hardworking farmers and ranchers in southwestern Colorado is that if you're running a ranch, you don't have a lot of time to drive around the state and go to policy meetings. There are more important things to do than do that. So our job, that's why if you look back at the River District, why are we here? 82 years ago, your predecessors, the ranchers, farmers, industry, cities' predecessors said, we need a voice of Western Colorado on the water. So that's what our district is doing in a representative capacity. And I have to tell you, I recognize that we're only representatives. I don't own a water right, okay? I don't irrigate a field. But I can speak on your behalf if I can get your input. And so we welcome that input, we welcome that direction. Our job is to get out, and you'll see us out over the next year at an incredible force at anywhere. And if you would like us to be at your meeting locally, your Cattlemen's Association or your Family Farm Alliance meeting or the Farm Bureau or you name it, local, any meeting, Ditch Owners Association, get in touch with us. We'll be there. We need to hear from you, and we need to drive that process. I will also say that Our own district is putting together an effort together with the Southwestern Water Conservation District, a stakeholder process that is somewhat limited just in size, but representative of the water use and the different basins within our district, so agriculture, industry, and urban, to bounce ideas off, to do some truth testing on what a market might look like, what the structure of a system might look like. And we'll be bringing that around the Western Slope to ask people, does this work? Does it not? What would work better? The reality is what works in some parts of the basin might not work in other parts. And certainly what works on the Front Range, when we look at it, and keep in mind, we pushed very hard a year ago, and the CWCB agreed that a demand management program, if it ever exists, will require water contributions from the West Slope and the East Slope. And our push in terms of what that means, it means directly proportionate to their post-compact depletions. You'll hear from John Kieran a little bit later that means, from our numbers, about 60% of any water in a demand management program needs to come off the East Slope, right? And the other 40%, we've got to figure out how to generate it. But we've got to do it in a way that doesn't cause harm to our local economies. The River District, you'll hear about our efforts with a number of others later today. We're trying to figure out what that economic impact will be if there is a demand management program and how to mitigate it. Again, the development of good information and data to protect Western Colorado's communities and our water users. So, does that answer the question, Marty?
Oh.
All right.
Here's a question from Don Schwint.
Ken Curtis.
Andy, I want to circle you back to your answer to Jim's question about the Lower Basin structural deficit and backfilling aquifers underneath Arizona and the cities down there in that area. As I've watched this discussion unfold, we don't have aquifers, I don't think, in western Colorado that work like they do down there. But I'm convinced that we do have what I've chosen to now call groundwater storage, different things that provide multi-year drought protection. And as we look to this next set of interim guidelines and explore demand management, do we have enough, in your mind, or science available to think about how that we might be having consequences that way that may be impacted by whatever we do with our next set of interim guidelines that ended up being manipulated as we've seen it in today's world in the Lower Basin? In the water business, I've seen, I think Arizona probably had a pretty good handle on that knowledge base as they moved into that set of, the last set of interim guidelines. I'm concerned that we don't have that set of data that we need in the near future. And my question is, what are your thoughts down that line, and how could we backfill my concerns, or hopefully you've got some positive ideas already to answer that question?
Well, quickly. I have to be quick. Sorry, Don. No, so Don, I think you raised a really good point. And I would say that the Southwestern District, on which you sit on the board, and the River District have both been pushing and leading in the Upper Basin to develop that science. And frankly, we'd like to see the other states share the burden of the costs of developing that science and have the same passion and desire to see that science get developed and pushed. Right now, I would say that, for instance, the modeling that's been done on behalf of the Upper Colorado River Commission has been paid in large part by the Colorado River District. And that's our job, and we're happy to contribute to it, but we need to push harder at this multi-state level for the development of that data.
Okay, one more quick question, Ken.
Andy, I agree with your comments, but so it sounds to me, and I'd like you to comment if this is what you're thinking, that we got in a rush. We responded to an emergency, we're in a fire drill, and we got the cart before the horse, and now you are going out and broadening the conversation with the water rights holders. I mean, so could you talk a little bit about the schedule? Because obviously 2026 looms out there, but talk a little bit about the milestones and where you see it going over several years.
Sure.
When you can get a water rights holder off the work field, potentially in the off-season.
Sure. Ken, I think that's a good question. I don't believe that we're going to see a demand management program even roll out of the state of Colorado's bureaucracy for at least 2 more years. When you look at their own work plan schedule and their own concepts, they've got an awful lot of work to do under their own plan. I think we have time. I would say this, that if 2019, I mean, we have seen since July an incredibly dry, hot period once again developing. If that continues through the winter of 2020, you're going to hear a lot of people screaming and yelling about it, right? What we have to remember is that this is a long-term problem that needs a long-term solution. And demand management is not something that we at the River District believe should be rushed. We need to spend the time to get the input from those people who participate in the market with their water rights, meaning they're out there growing things or they're out there providing water to their urban customers, so that we know how it might actually work for them and their communities. And so we don't want to see it happen, I would tell you, anytime in the next 3 years. So we have time to get that input and really test the potential, what we see as what must be a guided market. How does it work? Or, you know, and I have to say, I frankly would say we also have to understand, and I hope everybody does, we may spend a lot of time looking at this and decide collectively that it's a terrible idea and not pursue it. So it's not a done deal by any means from our perspective.
So he said, period. Thank you, Andy.
Thank you.